Hi everyone, it's Miss Sheehan, and today I'm going to do a lecture on slavery and the slavery system in the United States before the Civil War. So what I want to start off with is just a reminder that this is a discussion of one of the most horrible atrocities that the US really has ever committed, which was the system of slavery. And just, I think it's important for you to remember because it's easy to make this all kind of academic or kind of dissociate ourselves from this, was that slavery kept millions of people in bondage for hundreds of years, right? And it included such horrible things within that bondage as rape, murder, kidnapping, torture, imprisonment, punishment, etc. Right? So not only was the atrocity taking away people's freedom, but also there were all these other atrocities included in the system of slavery itself. And then even when slavery ended in the US at the end of the Civil War, right, the US continued to deny people who had been enslaved or people of color rights and civil liberties and kept murdering, torturing, and imprisoning them because of their heritage and skin color. So the atrocity didn't stop when slavery stopped, right? It continued. And that's something we're going to kind of trace throughout this year. So I want you to keep that in the forefront of your mind. Please treat this subject with the seriousness and respect the people who suffered under it deserve, right? And keep those people, right? This happened to living, breathing people, maybe it was your ancestors, right? So keep those people in the front of your mind and don't kind of let it become all academic for you. Okay. So as we've discussed, slavery was a part of the United States from the very beginning, right? Like we talked about the first slaves being traded for food with the colonists as early as 1619, right? The US actively participated in the Atlantic slave trade, which hopefully you learned about in world history, right? That the transport of enslaved folks from Africa over to the Caribbean and South America and North America, and then the sale of the resources those enslaved people created back to Europe, and so on and so forth, right? However, the US was a little bit different in that most enslaved people in the US were born under slavery rather than traded, right? The actual number of people imported from Africa to the US was actually fairly low, especially in comparison to places like Brazil or the Caribbean. So according to the 1860 census, right at the start of the Civil War, there were approximately 4 million enslaved people in the United States. And that was out of a population of 31 million. So that was about 12% of the population was enslaved, which is a very large number, right? Okay, so uh, the founders, as the Constitution was being created, right, the founders and the delegates to the Constitutional Convention argued about the inclusion of slavery in the United States government. So if you take a moment and just pause and read, right, this is a transcript of an argument about slavery from the Constitutional Convention. And there's a lot of different ways, right? The Constitution is a vague document, so there's a lot of different ways to interpret what the founders meant and what their intent was for slavery in the new United States. But the fact remains that it is included in the Constitution, right? And the way it's included in the Constitution is through what was called the 3/5 Compromise. So the 3/5 Compromise was the way the founders chose to resolve the argument over whether enslaved people should be counted for the purposes of representation, right? Because remember, the number of House representatives a state has is dependent on how many people live in that state. So obviously, states with more enslaved people, like the southern states, would want those enslaved people to count for purposes of representation so that then they could have more House representatives, right? Remember, this was not an argument about who would be citizens, who got the right to vote, etc. It was just for the purposes of representation, right? So obviously slave states wanted enslaved people to count. Non-slave states didn't want enslaved people to count, right? So what they came up with was this formula where basically representation just for purposes of House representatives would equal the whole number of free persons, that meant white people, plus 3/5 of all other persons, which was really code for slavery or for slaves, right? And that was called the 3/5 Compromise. So here's the actual text of it. in Article 2. And that remained the way that representation was counted up until the 13th Amendment was passed, which banned slavery and rewrote this piece of the Article 2. That, as we'll talk about more, really set up a kind of uneasy balance, right? As states enter the Union, the decision over whether to be a slave state or to be a free state was really important. And so that will be one thing that comes up again and again as we examine the lead up to the Civil War. The founders, however, did leave the question about legality of slavery up to individual states, right? So some states kept slavery legal, some states made it illegal. Just it's important to note that besides Brazil, the US was the last major country to ban slavery, and we banned it in 1865, right? For example, major European powers had banned it about 50 years earlier. France abolished it in 1794, and then Great Britain in 1807, right? So we actually kind of resisted this global trend of abolishing slavery. And in fact, the international slave trade was actually banned in 1808. The Atlantic slave trade really was supposed to stop as early as 1808, but the US continued to actively participate in the sale and transport of slaves up until the end of the Civil War. Okay, so why did slavery become such an important piece of the United States economy? All right, so as you've learned about, the Industrial Revolution began in textile mills. Textile is cloth, right? In England in the 1760s. Quickly spread to America in the following decades, right? And one thing the Industrial Revolution did was increase the demand for cotton and boosted the production of textiles. And guess where cotton was mainly grown? In the South of the United States, right? The South was an ideal climate for growing cotton. And because cotton is a very labor-intensive plant, to harvest it is very you know, you have to have a lot of people doing it. So as the demand for cotton soared, so did the demand for slave labor, right? And then the other positive, or the other reason people wanted slave labor is because you didn't have to pay them. So you could increase your profit on your cotton, right? So from 1790 to 1860, cotton production in the United States skyrocketed. It became a major exported crop. And something that contributed to this production was in 1794, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And this made it easier to separate the cotton fibers, which is what you use for like creating thread and weaving, from the seeds. So as you can see here in this picture, right, that's the little cotton ball, and then within that are the seeds. So to get the actually useful fibers, you have to like kind of separate those. So what the cotton gin did was separate the fibers from the seeds. So without the gin, a person could only clean about 1 pound of cotton in a single day. Excuse me, with the cotton gin, a person could clean 50 pounds in a single day. So this radically increases the efficiency of cotton production, right? And really after 1820, cotton represents a majority of US export. It very quickly becomes almost the #1 thing that the US is exporting to other countries. And it is important to think about, although the cotton gin made cotton cleaning more effective, no machine was invented during this period to make picking cotton more efficient. And that's where a lot of slave labor was used, was picking the cotton, because essentially they didn't have tractors or automatic things that could go out and pick those individual cotton balls off the plants. That had to be done by hand. So most enslaved people in the South lived on plantations, although there is a movement now among historians and people who study slavery to stop calling them plantations and start calling them forced labor camps, because plantation kind of conjures up this idea of like gentility and wealth and agriculture, where really these were places that were designed to make money off the bodies of enslaved people, right? So maybe they're better thought of as forced labor camps. And on these forced labor camps, the enslaved people picked and processed the cotton. Slaves were threatened with violence if they didn't make cotton picking quotas each day. They had to pick a certain amount, right? And men called overseers, usually white men, although sometimes there were also enslaved people who were overseers, were in charge of supervising slaves on the fields. They used whips and physical abuse, right? So slave owners sought to make their slaves completely dependent on them, right? And really, they did that by enforcing a system of restrictive codes and laws and rules that governed life among enslaved people. This included such things as prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read and write, restricting their behavior, restricting their movement. A lot of enslaved people who lived on the plantations could not leave the plantations. Sometimes they couldn't leave certain towns, right? Etc. Many slave owners raped enslaved women regularly, right? And this was also used as a form of dominance and control, right? And often a form of punishment for the men and the women. And rebellious slaves were brutally punished with the whip and other punishments. So this here is a very famous picture of an enslaved man showing the scars on his back from whips. And this was a picture actually that abolitionists used to try and show people the brutality of slavery at the time. And there was also an enforced hierarchy among enslaved people, from enslaved people who were able to work in the houses, right, or be like the domestic servants, from the people who were artisans or who made stuff, down to the lowest rung, which was the people who worked in the fields. And this really helped to keep them divided and less likely to organize against the slave owners, right? And that was really the goal of all these codes and restrictions, was to keep enslaved people in ignorance, in division, and not able to come together and really work towards their freedom as a unit. So here are just some examples of instruments used to torture slaves. And another way of controlling enslaved people was basically of stripping them of their culture and history, right? So for example, slaves who came from Africa were stripped of their African names and given English ones. Enslaved people were given the last names of their masters, and this is why even now many Black Americans have traditionally white or European names. That's, you know, their family name was the name of their slave owners, right? Enslaved people who were freed often took the name Freeman, or the names of the founders like Washington and Jefferson, Franklin. That was very common, right? So for example, Morgan Freeman, right, the actor, his family was can trace their heritage back to freed slaves. Another example is Denzel Washington, right? But this was really a way of separating enslaved people from their identity and history, right? Enslaved people did their best to uphold tradition and family unity, but their lack of education, their lack of resources, and the lack of stability really prevented this. And a lot of slave owners went to efforts to break up families, right? This led to a unique slave culture that was a blend of various African traditions. And one thing we see, and that we'll talk about when we get into the post-slavery period, and especially like into the 1920s, is this kind of resurgence of Black Americans trying to find their family history and family culture, and really kind of exploring what it meant to have that stripped away from generations of people, right? And what does it mean to be really a people without a history? Slave marriages had no legal basis. They were not officially allowed to marry, but enslaved people did marry and often raised large families. Most slave owners encouraged this practice, primarily because any children born to slave women were automatically slave themselves. But they would routinely divide up slave families by sale or removal of the children or the parents, right? So many enslaved people did not grow up with their parents because they were sold off. So enslaved people were sold regularly across the United States. They did not have a choice in either being sold or who they were sold to. Children were often sold away from their families. There are many, many firsthand accounts of crying baby or toddlers literally being sold out of their mother's arms and then never seeing them again. Between 1760 and 1860, approximately 1.2 million enslaved women, men, and children were sold in the United States. So this was a huge part of the American economy, was the sale of enslaved people. There were auctions and open-air slave markets at or near almost all major ports, not only the ones in the South, like New Orleans, Savannah, and Charleston, but also major cities in the North, like Boston, New York City, and Washington, D.C. itself. It was very, very common. Before being sold, enslaved people were often kept in pens, like cattle, or in private jails. And actually, there's a movie that came out a few years ago called 12 Years a Slave, which is based on a book written by a man he was Black, he was born free, and he was kidnapped and drugged and sold into slavery for 12 years before he escaped. And that was pretty common as well, was, just because of a person's skin color, even if they were free, you could essentially end up a slave and being sold into slavery. And many smaller towns sold people on the courthouse steps or in front of City Hall. So it was very, very common for slaves to be sold. So these are just a couple of advertisements, right? You can see here. And then this one is interesting because it's selling off land, but as well as slaves, and then also horses, cattle, hogs, sheep, yoke steers, wagons, etc., tools. So it really just equates those people with property and animals, right? Just like you would sell off property and animals maybe after a landowner died, that was also the way they treated slaves. So here's a couple more example of advertisements, right? And I think this is an interesting or a powerful anecdote. So I'm just going to read it here. So we know from enslaved people themselves, the relative few who are able to write or otherwise tell their stories, that the auction block was even more feared than a lashing. Common as are slave auctions in the southern states, wrote one formerly enslaved man, Josiah Henson, the full misery of the event, of the scenes which precede and succeed it, is never understood till the actual experience comes. The New Deal era Slave Narratives Project, funded by the Works Progress Administration, is full of terrifying memories like this one from a formerly enslaved woman in Arkansas named Will Ann Rogers. When Ma was a young woman, she said they put her on a block and sold her. They auctioned her off at Richmond, Virginia. When they sold her, her mother fainted or dropped dead. She never knew which. She wanted to go and see her mother lying over there on the ground, and the man what brought her wouldn't let her. He just took her on, drove her off like cattle, I reckon. So another example of being sold away from your family and never seeing your parents again and never even knowing what had happened to them. Okay, so slavery was an immensely wealthy, an immensely huge part of the economy of the US. If the Confederacy, the states that became the Confederacy during the Civil War, had been a separate nation, it would have ranked as the fourth richest nation in the world by 1860. So people made huge amounts of money, both off slave labor, the production of cotton, and the sale of slaves themselves. By 1860, the South was producing 75% of the world's cotton, and it created more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the nation, right? So people got insanely rich off this. And in the early 1700s, slaves would fetch between about $5 and $10, right? But by 1860, both due to the banning of the international slave trade and also the huge amount of money that slaves were bringing in by picking and processing cotton, an able-bodied slave was bought and sold for an average price between $1,200 and $1,500, okay, which is in 1860 dollars. So Southern white society was really dominated by the aristocratic land-owning elite, the people who owned and operated the plantations or forced labor camps. That elite, those people at the top had much of the economic and political power in the South. Their forced labor camps usually spanned upward of 1,000 acres. They were huge plots of land, and they controlled hundreds of enslaved people. Below that elite class were the smaller planters who often owned a handful of enslaved people, right? So maybe 10 or 15. And then at the bottom of this southern white hierarchy was the small farmers and landless whites who often didn't own slaves. So there was a significant class difference between the plantation owners and the landless white people in this southern hierarchy. But one thing that really they used to separate themselves from enslaved people and people of color was the idea of white supremacy. That even if you were a poor white Southerner, you were still white, right? So the idea that they all belong to the superior race. And many people who owned slaves convinced themselves that they were actually doing a religious and moral good thing by taking care of what they believed was an inferior people, which were Black people. And that was a way they justified the brutality and horror of slavery to themselves, was by making it basically a duty, or by saying, no, we're actually doing a good thing, right? So it's important to remember that slavery in the US really developed into a racialized system. Being Black or African, of African descent, was part and parcel of being a slave in the United States. And that makes slavery in the US a little bit different than slavery in many parts of the country where it was not racialized. But in the US, it was very heavily racialized. And there were many popular scientific, quote unquote, and social theories that attempted to justify enslaving Black people, like the one I mentioned, where it became a moral duty to take care of inferior people, or the idea that Black people were happy under slavery, right? And that was a way for white people to justify keeping this system going. But what it really came down to was race, wealth, and power, right? Just like with Native Americans and Mexican Americans, Black people were simply not accepted as the equal of whites. Slavery became not only a way to make money off the bodies of Black people, but also a way to enforce a racial hierarchy that kept white Americans in power. And it can be argued still keeps white Americans in power, right? One of the things we're going to look at is how the effects of slavery and the effects of this segregation of Black and white Americans has lingered on for the last 150 years since the end of slavery, right? Even though slavery ended, the imprisonment, the murder, the torture, the denying of civil rights and civil liberties of Black people and people of color in the US has not ended. And that is the legacy of slavery in the United States. Okay, as always, please ask me if you have any questions, and thank you for listening.